I take the position that our Confederation is functioning exactly the way it was intended to do. And that is that Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, basically the West, were always intended to be the colonial serfs and the colonial servants of Ontario and Quebec, and that all of our wealth was, not our wealth. It was, basically we were to work to generate the wealth for all the plutocrats in Eastern Canada, which is still the way that Canada functions to our detriment to it. And that's one of the big reasons that, those of us that are involved in the independence movement say that we have to get the hell out of Canada. I mean, one of the big things we need is a constitution that actually puts limits on government and government corruption. We don't want attorneys general and solicitors general and public safety officers that sit in cabinet with the prime minister or the premier. Those people need to be individually elected people that have the mandate to arrest and jail crooked politicians.
Hi everyone, welcome back to the Critical Compass. Today we are pleased to be joined by Mr. Jeff Rath. He is the, I know he's been called the CEO before and he corrects everyone. He's the counsel for the Alberta Prosperity Project. I would say probably he's the most prominent voice in the Alberta Prosperity Project right now. He's a longtime Indigenous rights lawyer in Alberta. He's won cases all over the country. And he's a very important voice right now, traveling all over the province for Alberta independence. So, Jeff, thank you for joining us. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Pleasure. James, I know you had a litany of questions that we're going to throw Jeff's way, so why don't you get us started?
Yeah, I guess if we were just going to sell our left-leaning friends, I know we've got a lot of people on the right that are already sold on this idea, seeing the harms that are kind of bestowed upon Alberta from Ottawa. If we were going to widen that, what's just an elevator pitch to somebody who's who hasn't really given this any thought and maybe more left-leaning or public sector worker?
Well, I mean, I think for everybody, it's like, if it doesn't matter whether it's not a left or right issue, do you want yourself, your children and your grandchildren to be wealthy and prosperous, right? And we think that the easiest way for everybody in Alberta to become much more wealthy and much more prosperous is to do away with all levels of all federal taxes in Alberta, get rid of all of them. So federal income tax, capital gains tax, carbon tax, whatever they're now calling the carbon tax on gasoline that they're bringing back under some sort of alleged road user fee from the federal government that they're going to bring back in, being a carbon tax under any other name, estate taxes. I mean, keep in mind, the federal government wants to tax people's home equity, right? So, if you don't want to have the value of your home taxed away from underneath you by Marxist Carney and the nut jobs that he's got in his cabinet, you should vote for Alberta independence. The big thing that we're all about, and again, it's not a left or right issue, what the Alberta Prosperity is all about is exactly this, the value of freedom, right? And that is that by leaving Canada and becoming an independent country, Alberta immediately in year one is going to have a $30 to $50 billion a year fiscal capacity surplus. And again, those are very conservative numbers, because when we did the value of freedom, we did it on the basis of a $6.5 billion deficit. This year we have an $8.5 billion surplus. So those numbers are actually light by $15 billion a year right now, which means that, the real number, the fiscal capacity surplus for Alberta would be between $45 billion a year and $65 billion a year. I mean, that's significantly more. That's significantly more for hospitals, for schools, for education, for families, and massive tax cuts for everybody in this province. So I can, for the life of me, can't imagine why anybody wouldn't vote for independence, and why all of our all of our leaders, when they read the value of freedom document, talking about how much stronger and how much better off all Albertans are going to be economically once we leave Canada, how it's not a violation of their fiduciary obligations to every citizen in this province by not pursuing this path, right? I mean, at law, the standard of a fiduciary is a reasonably prudent person of business managing their own affairs. And, if somebody were to tell, a fiduciary, hey, there's a simple legal mechanism to make sure that you don't have to pay, you can cut your tax bill in half. If that fiduciary didn't do that, they'd be guilty of a violation of their fiduciary obligation. Right. So, that's where we come from, on this stuff. We think that, people really do need to go to albertaprosperityproject.com and download, this document and read it and internalize it, because this document makes it clear, the value of freedom makes it clear that Alberta will be significantly better off outside of Confederation than in it. I mean, let's face it. I mean, right now, when you look at, the national debt, the levels of inflation, I mean, Trudeau basically and Carney basically doubled the Canadian money supply in the last 5 years. So if you wonder why everything at a grocery store costs twice as much as it did 5 years ago, it's because your money is worth half as much, right? Canada is a rotting corpse, and Albertans are tired of being chained to it. We need to cut those chains, and we need to get away from that stinking putrid mass that is Canada, because they're going to kill us. Canada's a sinking ship, and we can't continue to support, this country that hates us, doesn't understand our culture, doesn't respect us, thinks our industries are filthy and dirty, and that there's no business case, for our existence. I mean, think about how stupid that is. I mean, Trudeau and Carney basically told Japan and Germany, to go, pee up a rope when they came here saying, hey, we want to buy Alberta natural gas, and have LNG shipped from Canada to our countries. Oh no, there's no business case for that. There's no business case for Alberta LNG. Well, what just happened? Trump just did 2 massive trade deals with Japan and Europe, and Trump's bragging on TV about how part of those trade deals are that the United States is now going to supply $700 billion worth of LNG to Europe and Japan. So in effect, Carney and Trudeau cost Alberta $700 billion in LNG sales by telling those people that there's no business case for Alberta LNG. I mean,
yeah.
These are the idiots that are governing us, and we need to get out from underneath it, pure and simple.
Yeah, I remember when you said that the first time, and I was like, I mean, it's only business case. From top to bottom, the whole thing is business case, especially when what was happening in Russia and Ukraine just starting off at the time. But I think primarily, Jeff, I mean, at least in our circles, I mean, me and James are kind of, we're reformed former leftists, and we still have a lot of family and friends who hear kind of, they hear things like Alberta independence, and they hear, separatists, and they hear these kind of terms.
And they hear terms like Canada's a rotting corpse, and they get kind of upset.
Yeah. And their default assumption, I don't think, is about, hey, what's the business case about this? Like, maybe it should be, but what they think is, am I going to be able to travel to see my family in Saskatchewan, or is this going to affect my pension or my, whatever? Like, what do you say to people like that?
Sure, let's talk about all of those things, because it was actually a really interesting piece of misinformation. There's some senator up in Edmonton. I can't remember his name now. He was the guy that was involved in getting rainbow hockey tape put on hockey sticks. Anyway, it doesn't matter. That individual, right? So, we're telling people around the province at various APP town halls, don't worry about your Canadian citizenship. Don't worry about your pension. Because, pensions are a contractual obligation between you and CPP. It makes no difference if you're in Costa Rica, Portugal, Southern California, Florida, Arizona, whatever. Whatever CPP you're owed. Doesn't matter if you're in Alberta. You're still going to get your CPP. And then on top of it, Canada does not recognize the renunciation of citizenship. So, Mark Carney has like 4 citizenships. Like, Mike Myers, Mr. Elbows Up. Right. He has like 3 citizenships, UK, US, and Canadian. Right. Yeah. Just because Mike Myers swore an oath to the United States government, I actually think they should deport Mike Myers, frankly, but I'll get into that in a minute, because like the very first sentence of the US citizenship oath is that you renounce all other foreign citizenships and allegiances. So Mike Myers swore that oath to become an American. And then he comes up to Canada and says, oh, I'm still a Canadian, and elbows up, Canada, blah, blah, blah. Well, he obviously swore a false oath. He fraudulently obtained American citizenship, if he still claims to be a Canadian citizen and still has a Canadian passport. So, Myers, basically is an illegal alien as far as I'm concerned, and he should be deported from the United States. But, that's where that goes. So no, nobody loses their citizenship. Nobody loses their pension. And if you read the Value of Freedom document, which is really interesting, we're going to have so much excess fiscal capacity in Alberta. Like, think about the fact that we're not going to be having to pay refugees $80,000 a year anymore, because that's not going to happen under the immigration and deportation plan that's laid out in this document, right? So, we're easily going to have enough money left over to, double the pensions of every pensioner in Alberta, double the GIS, the guaranteed income supplement, double the old age security, in a free and independent Alberta, because we'll have the money to do it, because we're no longer, contributing to the $1.5 billion that goes to CBC every year. We're no longer going to be contributing the $15 billion that goes to Quebec every year because they cook their books and claim to be a have-not province. All of that money is going to stay in Alberta. So everything, this Value of Freedom document makes it clear that in a free and independent Alberta, and it's actually costed into that document in terms of the fiscal capacity surplus that we're citing. It's factored into that document that university tuitions in Alberta would be capped at $7,500 a year. So, we could easily cut university tuitions in half and still have lots of money left over to lower taxes. So, so this document, everybody goes, oh, well, it's like all of you people that are involved in the independence movement are far right extremists. My politics haven't changed in 40 years, right? I'm basically, what used to be an old, centrist Canadian, right? I was just as, I personally think that Paul Martin was one of the best conservative finance ministers that we ever had. And as far as I'm concerned, Harper, who's this alleged economist, was a socialist when he lowered the GST to 5% from 7% that Paul Martin put in, right? So, so that's basically where I'm at. I've always been a believer in, that every civilized country has to take care of our poor, our elderly, our weak, our sick, whatever. But you have to have a functioning economy in order to be able to do that, right? Yeah. And we're now at a point in Canada where our economy is dysfunctional, and the Liberals have made it that way on purpose, right? So that's why we need to get the hell out of Canada. We need to get out of the mismanagement. We need to get rid of all the gross overspending, all this foolish, the world is going to end nonsense in and around climate change, et cetera, and chart our own course, forward to the future.
Yeah. And it seems like part of that conversation would be even just pointing out the massive amount of waste. So you would look at Canada like, well, we're a large country. We've got a wide range of subcultures and this vast distance. And right now our Confederation is not functioning in the way that it was designed to. And we don't have the proper respect for the sovereignty of what is under the jurisdiction of each province. And
well, I would beg to differ on that point. I take the position that our Confederation is functioning exactly the way it was intended to do. And that is that Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, basically the West, were always intended to be the colonial serfs and the colonial servants of Ontario and Quebec. And that all of our wealth was, not our wealth. It was, basically we were to work to generate the wealth for all the plutocrats in Eastern Canada, which is still the way that Canada functions to our detriment. I mean, when Trudeau stands up and says, "Oh, I want to," and what's SNC Lavalin called now, Actus Borealis, or some sort of weird name that sounds like a venereal disease, right? Like, which I guess is fitting given that they're hiring prostitutes to get business contracts under SNC Lavalin. They may as well change their name to something that sounds like a venereal disease, right? But anyway, you got the SNC Lavalin company under whatever new name it's under, they're in there like a dirty shirt wanting to build Trudeau's $40 billion electric choo-choo train from, Montreal to Toronto. Well, who the hell is going to pay for that? We were. That's the way the system's supposed to work, right? That stupid Pathways project, the giant carbon sucking machine that's supposed to decarbonize Alberta oil, right? Well, all of those Eastern companies like, SNC Lavalin, PCL Construction, like all of these massive liberal associated, Brookfield associated companies are lined up with their knives and forks waiting to dig into the trough of 50 billion taxpayer dollars to build a project that has no economic reason or rationale for existing. All of this stuff is just ridiculous. I mean, everybody watching this, and especially, if you have relatives that still believe in climate change, right? They need to go to something called Google and Google Professor Halper or Happer from Princeton. And he does a 45-minute talk and he's an actual climate scientist, on how we could double CO2 in the atmosphere to 880 parts per million. And it would have a 1%, not 1 degree, but would only have a 1% change in the temperature of the earth. Right. I mean, but nobody wants to talk about that. Right. So this whole climate change thing, is a massive fraud. We all know that, surprise, surprise, the one thing that, that regulates the temperature of the earth the most is something called the sun, that big yellow ball in the sky that gives us, sunburns from time to time, that thing. Right. So all the rest of this stuff has just been a fraud that's been designed by the World Economic Forum and people like Al Gore to basically create all these phony projects like Pathways Alliance, where they can literally not just suck carbon out of the air, but suck tax dollars like a vacuum out of all of our pockets into their offshore bank accounts that we're not allowed to ask about. Right. And look at all the foolishness that's gone on in Canada over the last number of years. Right. Remember, Trudeau saying that, oh, yes, the government's going to subsidize heat pumps across Canada. What a wonderful thing that will be. Well, not considering at all how much electricity those suckers use, and how they potentially could collapse entire provincial power grids, right? No thought whatsoever to the fact that these so-called heat pumps don't work at temperatures below -5. So, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, the one thing they didn't want us to know, that the owner, the company that owns the largest heat pump manufacturing company in North America is Brookfield, right? So every heat pump that gets sold effectively would be sucking money out of our taxpayers' pockets, and then pumping that money into Carney's secret offshore bank accounts that we're not allowed to ask about, right? So that's what this is all about. I mean, we live in a kleptocracy now. It's just bizarre that people aren't awake to that and paying attention to it. And that's one of the big reasons that, those of us that are involved in the independence movement say that we have to get the hell out of Canada. I mean, one of the big things we need is a constitution that actually puts limits on government and government corruption. We don't want attorneys general and solicitors general and public safety officers that sit in cabinet with the prime minister or the premier. Those people need to be individually elected people that have the mandate to arrest and jail crooked politicians, right? We need to have limits on government spending. We need to have limits on, the size of the civil service. Like, when I talk about, being somebody who studied economics in a classical sense, your economy becomes completely dysfunctional when a third of your population is either too young or too old to work. A third of your population is employed by government in some form of government service, and only 1/3 of your population is productive, and they have to pay for everybody else. At what point are we not in the Ayn Rand Atlas Shrugged type scenario where all the people that are actually productive members of society and have capital and whatever are just going to say, screw it, I'm out of here. And I think that's
you can swear.
But, that's what's happening now. I mean, we're seeing, capital flight from Canada at a very high level. People that are productive, that have money, that can leave are actually leaving, right? And they're taking their money with them. And who can blame them? Sell your house. If you don't want to have the equity in your house sold out from or taxed out from underneath you, you're better off to sell your house and go. Put your money into Bitcoin and move to Costa Rica. That's what lots of people are doing. Just to protect themselves from the Canadian government.
So, Jeff, if it's as you say, and you believe that in Confederation essentially has set up the Western have provinces, the productive provinces, to kind of always be this, never-ending bank for the East to draw from, why do you think it's taken so long for a movement like this to materialize how it sort of has over the last few months?
Well, I think there's a lot of factors that have coalesced at one time. I mean, and I think you have to look at, what used to be the separation movement or the independence movement in Alberta. It was highly disorganized. We still see the same thing today. I mean, you still, and I call it the sort of the Yertle the turtle complex, right? You've got all of these little Yertles wanting to be the top turtle and, fighting with one another over who's going to be in charge once we become independent without stopping to consider that the first thing we have to do is become independent, right? So, I think one of the reasons that we're being so successful is because, we set we looked at that, we knew that that was a problem, and we set the Alberta Prosperity Project up as a nonpartisan educational society rather than a political party or political organization. And, as far as we're concerned, we want trade unionists to vote for independence. We want members of the NDP to vote for independence. We want everybody to focus on what's going to be the best for your children and, yourself, your children, and your grandchildren, and to vote for that, right? We're not going to get all of them. I mean, there's no doubt that there's a lot of dyed-in-the-wool, Naheed Nenshi types that have been living in their mother's basement for decades and, don't really understand how the functional economy works and, those types of things. We're never going to get those people on board, right? But, look at Trump's, President Trump's last election in the United States, 60% of the Teamsters voted for him. So, I think that's, what's really worrying the trade union bosses and the left wing in Alberta is that a lot of union members are voting for independence. I mean, nurses, doctor, policemen, firemen, especially trade unionists, like guys that are working in the trades, like plumbers, pipe fitters, welders, those guys. I mean, they belong to a union, but it's like, goddamn right, Jeff, we want to get out of, we need to get out of Canada. We need to get out right now, right? And they're adamant about it, so, and I think that all the trade union bosses and the union bosses are really worried about the fact that a lot of their membership is actually going to vote for independence. They might not say so now, but I know the support's there because everywhere we go, we're talking to them. I'm overhearing conversations about independence. I mean, I was in a line with my daughter at Canadian Tire the other weekend, and there are a couple of people ahead of me in line that were talking about how much better off Alberta is going to be once it gets the hell out of Canada. I mean, it's everywhere now. Whereas back in the days of Gordy Kessler and, sort of the early independence movement, there was also that, unfortunate connotation that a lot of them were, had some very interesting views with regard to, and we'll get into Indigenous rights in a minute, Indigenous rights, the rights of people other than Christians, all that kind of stuff. And I mean, we want to get, that's what APP was designed to get away from all of that. Right. And to be a, sort of a clean break, from that connotation. So I always laugh when people say, "Oh, you're a bunch of right-wing extremists." I said, "Really? Have you read The Value of Freedom?" Like all what we're talking about is just having more money for social services and more money for every Albertan. We're talking about, tripling the amount of money spent on Indigenous people in the province of Alberta to lift them out of the crushing poverty that Canada has put them in and kept them in for the last 150 years. Right? So, from our perspective, this is anything but, a right-wing exercise. I mean, this is just common sense as far as we're concerned for everybody. And my question for the chiefs that are all upset about, oh, you're going to take away our treaty rights. I mean, it's right in the notes to reader in the Value to Freedom document. It says it's important to note that the section dealing with the plan for Alberta's Indigenous nations is drafted with the utmost respect for the sovereign and Indigenous people of Alberta. It's in no way intended to replace or diminish treaty rights, which will be a required subject for discussion and negotiation in the context of the development of the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Alberta, which could include a continued role for the Crown of Alberta in the context of any future constitutional arrangement. It's not the purpose of this document to in any way prejudge or predetermine the outcome of any constitutional negotiations, which will proceed with all due respect to the constitutionally protected treaty and Aboriginal rights of Alberta's Indigenous people and their ongoing relationship with the Crown, right? So all these left-wing lawyers and consultants that have been running around, getting the chiefs upset, oh, they're going to take away your rights, and oh my goodness, your relationship is with the Crown. I'm completely ambivalent on the issue of whether, an independent Alberta, simply promotes the lieutenant governor to governor general, and that we're a constitutional republic that still nominally pays lip service to the British monarchy from time to time. I don't care. I mean, the monarchy is basically it's just a figurehead in Canada now under the Canadian Constitution anyway, right? So, it's one of those things where, everybody needs to understand that there's a process going forward. I mean, obviously, we're going to have a transition, to a transitional government and independence. We're going to have a constitutional convention. There's going to have to be a new constitution for Alberta. And what we're looking to do is we want to completely get rid of the Westminster system of governance and replace it with a system, much more akin, to a mixture of the U.S. model and the Swiss model, right? So, we have an elected legislature, we have an elected, or not an elected, we have an elected Senate, but based on the regions rather than population. So the populations of the city cannot destroy the lives of people that live in rural Alberta, right? We'd have an elected executive, like an executive, chief executive, and we'd have very key positions like the auditor general, the attorney general, solicitor general, et cetera, all being elected positions with a mandate to police government and to police politicians, right? And so on. So, and then on top of it, we would want citizens. And I mean, in this electronic age, there's no reason with bitchain or blockchain and everything else that every citizen couldn't have a unique blockchain identifier to vote. And, and why shouldn't why shouldn't every citizen vote on every budget? Right. To make sure that money's being allocated the way that citizens think they should be allocated. This isn't the 19th century anymore. You know what I mean? And then on top of it, we looking at some of the problems that they have in the US, with all the pork barrel politics that comes out of their system, why wouldn't we give a line item veto on spending to the chief executive? Right. To keep government spending from getting out of control. Why wouldn't we have a constitutionalized limit on government borrowing? Right. So the governments can't run up massive debts to where we're at the point that they are in Canada right now, where fully 50% of every tax dollar they take out of your pocket, goes to service the interest on the national debt. Right. So a lot of us that are in the independence movement see this as a real opportunity for creating, real freedom and creating a much better, healthier way to be governed. I mean, we'd also want constitutional limits, on the size of the bureaucracy. Like at no point should public employees in Alberta, exceed 10% of the total provincial workforce. On what planet should we have a third of the people that are working within the province be employed by the government? I mean, all of those things, we think could be constitutionalized and should be baked into, a constitution of a free and independent Alberta. On top of it, given the wealth of this province and the fiscal capacity surplus that we have in this province, why wouldn't we get, enshrine property rights in our constitution and eliminate property tax? Have reasonable, municipal user fees and find some way to do it. I think one of the authors of The Value of Freedom suggested that we do it on frontage, and a lot of farmers and ranchers were freaking out when they were calculating the amount of road that their properties fronted on. So there'd have to be a way to do it that's equitable, to our farmers and ranchers. But at the same time, I mean, there are costs associated with plowing roads, paving roads, fixing potholes on roads. And why shouldn't everybody pay, some sort of user fee, as opposed to a progressive income tax or property tax? If you use something, you should pay for it. Why shouldn't you? Right. And, and if you're really wealthy and you've got lots of money to do, to do those kinds of things, why wouldn't you want to? Right. So, that's kind of the direction where we're going, with all of these things. And does that sound like that's right-wing extremism? It certainly doesn't to me. Right.
No. And one of the like safeguards is a limited government is limited in its ability to become corrupt, or if somebody who gets in power who does not share your views, then there's safeguards preventing them from abusing that system.
Or imposing their views on you. It's like, oh, I decided today that because I think children should be exposed to pornography, but I'm going to put pornographic magazines in all of the schools because I like the idea of grooming children. Like, on what planet should that be allowed? Right? I mean, I'm sorry that, just because those are your personal beliefs and you got elected to, an elected office doesn't mean that you should be able to do it. Maybe it means you should be in jail. I'm not sure. Like,
I think closer to the second one than the first
yeah,
one.
right? I don't know whether you saw that. I created a bit of controversy the other week. I was actually suggesting that, if everybody in Canada thinks MAID is such a great idea, why doesn't every prisoner that goes into a maximum security prison not find a MAID brochure on their bunk? And every pedophile that gets sent off to protective custody, why don't they find a MAID brochure on their bunk? And why isn't it readily available to them? Like, why do we make it available to veterans that can't make ends meet? But we won't provide that same service to prisoners. I think we should. I mean, that's but that has nothing to do with independence, and that's an issue for another day, I suppose.
No, it's a good point. there have been other guys in this space who have talked about, like to your previous point about climate change. If you think the climate, you think that the Earth is overheating and it's overpopulated and too many people overproducing. Well, you're one of those too many people, aren't you? Why don't you be the first to check out? No, it never seems to be those people, right?
Well, I think that's it in a nutshell, right? So I've kind of lost the thread here of what we were talking about.
Yeah.
Well, James, I think you were leading into something.
Yeah. So
based on our
part of that is that would kind of circle back to like, how would you phrase some of this to some of the leftists? And that's one thing I hear often is right now, even if the APP is not, it's nonpartisan, it still gets lumped in with the right. And there are still many on the left who they look at the UCP and they can point to like, okay, some money was mismanaged there and they've got kind of this little scandal or things are happening. And it gets tricky to even push some of these ideas forward.
Aren't those the same elbows up people that just reelected Carney for 5 years of more government
there's
going to be mismanagement? I mean,
going to be hypocrisy
I don't think people,
in there.
I don't think people like that you're ever going to convince. I actually saw something really funny the other day, and it was a correlation between people that had multiple vaccine boosters and their tendency to vote liberal, right?
Yeah.
So, those people, you're never going to convince them, right? That those 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 booster shots that they took were bad for them, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you ask any of those people, whether they've had the full 15, right? I don't think there's anybody out there that's had more than 5. So for all those people that were so super pro-vax, super pro-COVID vaccine, they've all become unvaccinated anti-vaxxers, right?
Because if you're under 15, then you're an anti-vaxxer.
Yeah, none of them have had 15 shots. And if you want to shut on that subject, if you ever want to shut somebody up online that's bleeding on about it, it's like, well, wait a minute. If you haven't had your 15 shots, doctor, then you're an unvaccinated anti-vaxxer. And I don't think I should be talking to you anymore because you have no credibility on this subject, right?
Yeah.
And that's the problem, is that there's a lot of cognitive dissonance, in and around those people, right? And, they tend to believe what the government says. A lot of them work for the government. I mean, a lot of them are academics. And let's face it, academics are, by and large, all on the government tit. Like if you guys saw, if you guys saw that silly critique that Trevor Toome put out last week of our Value of Freedom document, it was evident that he didn't even read the document. This guy, and for people that don't know, Trevor Toome is a University of Calgary economist who somehow or other managed to get himself onto Danielle Smith's What's Next panel, right? And so, but if you Google Trevor Toome's conflict of interest, he actually has a published conflicts of interest statement that shows that he's still in the employ of the government of Canada in an advisory and consulting capacity as an economist. So you got to know that anything that he says is for the benefit of the government of Canada. And if he came out in favor of what we were doing, he'd be cut off of his little government of Canada gravy train faster than it would make your head spin. Look at little Timmy Caulfield, who was pretending to be a doctor. I mean, the guy's a lawyer, taught at the law faculty. And now, millions and millions and millions of dollars later, he's now, with some sort of, anti-misinformation group that still runs around telling people that COVID shots are good for them, notwithstanding all of the evidence to the contrary. Right.
Yeah.
So, and you look at all the academics in and around Timmy, little Timmy Caulfield and, all of the people of that ilk. I mean, they're all paid for their opinions by the government, and we can't believe a damn word that they say, for that reason, right? And this Trevor Toon character was, was basically the same thing. And of course, we pointed out, recently that everything that he said was wrong. It was based on a misreading of our document. And ever since then, he's shut up and hasn't said anything more about it. One of the things I found was really funny was that somebody actually challenged him on the idea that he said, oh, well, Alberta, if they separate from Canada and they're their own entity. So it's like an economist. Let's assume that Alberta will exist in a vacuum without access to any markets, right? So somebody responded to him online and said, well, wait a minute. What if, if you could assume that Alberta would have zero economic ties to Canada, which is a silly suggestion, right? If they entered into a free market with the United States where there are zero tariffs on both sides of the Alberta-US border and had a strong economic union with the United States, wouldn't they be far better off than they would be within their relationship with Canada? And Trevor Toom had to admit that would be the case, right? And everybody needs to understand that, again, it's just like this value of freedom document, that I've been talking about so much tonight. That was produced by, CEOs of financial institutions, actuaries, accountants, economists, auditors. There's a tremendous amount of input from, right across the spectrum of, Alberta industry, academia, economics, etc. that checked and cross-checked and rechecked all of the numbers in that document with a view towards, creating projections that were very, very, very conservative, right? On the theory that, hey, like under promise and over deliver, right? So, and we also didn't want to be attacked for, inflating numbers or being unduly optimistic and the rest of it, right? And, and the only way that, that Trevor Toom could suggest that we were unduly optimistic or, or overstating things was he was double counting things. And he wasn't understanding that certain scenarios in that document were either or, and they weren't cumulative, right? So, so that's, what we've been dealing with. So people really need to internalize, how much better off we're going to be as an independent country and get away from, all of these, all this thought that somehow or other, that we should have any emotional attachment to Canada or that there's some real value in staying in Canada. I mean, I was at that Red Deer What's Next panel meeting with Premier Smith like 3 weeks ago. And one of the things that was really interesting at that panel, the only reason that Premier Smith could come up with for why Alberta should stay in Canada was she felt it would be easier to get a pipeline at the tables that she was at if we were in Canada rather than outside of Canada, right? And I mean, from our perspective, I mean, that's a pretty silly statement. I mean, Keystone XL is back on the books. TCPL is working on it. Donald Trump's going to approve it. So there's going to be one new pipeline. So that'll add, according to Premier Smith, another $20 billion a year to the provincial economy. If BC doesn't want to give us a pipeline to Tidewater, I know because I've been down to Washington. It would be very easy for us to get a pipeline through Montana, Idaho, and Washington State to Seattle. So there's a pipeline to Tidewater. And if BC really doesn't want to give us one, then we could have a discussion with BC as to what tariffs we're going to put on the throughput of goods from British Columbia to Ontario as they transit Alberta by train. Nobody's going to be cutting off their nose to spite their face after independence. So, guys like Trevor Toom theorizing that Canada is going to be so mad at Alberta after independence, it's not going to trade with us at all.
Mad.
Are just stupid, right? I mean, it's the stupidest thing ever, right?
Yeah.
And, and people need to internalize that. There's no good argument left for Alberta remaining in Canada other than, I have this attachment to the Canadian flag. Well, you're still going to be a Canadian citizen. So nobody, we're going to have, we'll have more free speech in Alberta than we will if we stay in Canada because they're planning on shutting down the internet and preventing guys like you and I from having these conversations soon. Right. If Culture Minister Gibault has his way, right? So, we'll have more free speech in Alberta than in the rest of Canada. People can still fly their Canadian flags if they're so attached to it. They can wander around waving their Canadian passports in the air going, I'm so a Canadian. And they can go, good for you. We're happy for you. But don't you feel better that you're so much richer now that you don't have to pay tax, right? Like,
yeah, you're welcome. I remember when flying the Canadian flag was that was something that only right-wing extremists did in 2022.
I know. And I'm telling all of these people, for all of you that were flying the flag during the, because you're still driving around rural Alberta, you still see all these faded Canadian flags flying that are left over from the convoy. And I'm telling everybody, like, please stop flying that stupid worn out Canadian flag and go buy yourself a nice brand new shiny Alberta flag and fly that instead. Right.
Yeah.
And more as I'm driving through the province, I literally just came back from Grand Prairie on the weekend. I'm seeing more and more shiny Alberta flags flying from one end of the province to the other. And I'm really happy to see it, you know?
You know, Jeff, at the risk of souring the mood, and I know it will slightly, I want to ask you something that we talked with Bruce Party about. And I know you're best buddies with Bruce Party, and we'll get to more about him later. But something that we asked him that I'm curious about your response to is, what do you think? Just sort of picking up on this thread, what do you think the response would be from the Canadian government with respect to the military bases that are in the province? Because I know that that's sort of when you're talking about a nation and an independent state, you have to, consider what a military looks like. What do you anticipate?
Well, that's all fully costed in the value of freedom. First of all, from an APP perspective and from I think a negotiating perspective, Albertans need to remember that, over the last 40 years, we put over $850 billion in equalization into the rest of Canada, right? So any suggestion, when Alberta leaves Canada, 1/10 of the national debt will be $140 billion. Like, why would we take 1/10 of the national debt? Like, we've already more than paid our share of the national debt through equalization, right? And then on top of it, just because I've done this type of work and in the context of large claims that I've done, if you were to get the actuaries to work and apply even Bank of Canada interest, to the $840 billion that we provided to Canada over time, the real numbers are that Canada owes us something like 4 or 5 trillion, right? Like, I'm not exaggerating at all. I mean, that's, the compound interest applied to numbers, of that size over that length of time turn into those sorts of numbers, right? So, our position is, what's the dirt under those military bases worth, minus the, all of the environmental cleanup that's going to have to be done, et cetera, et cetera. That's a real estate issue. And, we won't charge you anything to take those bases over, one, right? Cleanup of unexploded ordnance. I mean, I was a combat engineer when I was a kid. I was in the Canadian military, and we used to blow things up all over Wainwright, and I mean, I can't even imagine how much unexploded ordnance is on Wainwright. Like, when we were on exercise, my last major exercise at Wainwright was RV-83, and we used to bivouac at night on exercise to the sound of the of 105 millimeter artillery shells flying over your head and then impacting another 5 miles or 10 miles downrange at Wainwright, right? So there's unexploded ordnance all over that base. Well, we won't charge Canada to clean it up. We'll just take it over, right? Same like Suffield. I mean, Suffield is a big biological chemical warfare training area. I mean, I don't even want to think about, some of the horror shows that are buried on Suffield. But again, we'll just take it over and not charge Canada to clean it up, right? I mean, that's, same thing with the national parks. I mean, they're within the borders of Alberta. We'll put a real estate value on them and we'll chalk it up to the $4, $5, $6 trillion you owe us and move on. Right.
That's all subject to negotiations. And so
of course,
these things are unknown until they're figured out.
Yeah. $365 billion in pensions. Right. Like, but what everybody needs to internalize, I mean, even if we just walked away from Canada tomorrow and we didn't get a nickel back, and I know people hate that bad, but anyway, if we didn't get a nickel back in
Alberta band.
Sorry, that was just a bad joke. That was bad. But anyway,
we'll keep them. They have heritage.
Yeah, no, I personally like Nickelback. But anyway, I think Chad Kruger's a great guy. But anyway, getting back to what I was saying, Alberta can easily afford to fund pensions at double or triple the current pension rate, indefinitely out of our fiscal capacity surplus, whether CPP gave us our share of the money back or not. So those are things like, nobody needs to worry about their pension, right? Just because of the amount of money we're going to have left over when we no longer have to send money to Ottawa, right? And all the tax revenue that's generated in Alberta stays in Alberta. The other thing that Trevor Toome didn't even consider or talk about when he was talking about how much poorer Alberta's going to be if it leaves Canada is the economic boom that's going to happen in this province once 100% of all of our money stays in Alberta to be spent in Alberta, right? Like the APP Value of Freedom Plan, when we talk about tripling the spend on Indigenous communities in Alberta, right? All of that money gets spent in Alberta. Like, wouldn't we rather have, $5 billion going to Indigenous communities in Alberta with 100% of that money being spent in Alberta than have $15 billion a year going to Quebec to have 100% of that money being spent in Quebec? From an economic perspective, I mean, Alberta is going to be booming once all of the money that we currently send to Quebec, Ontario, the Maritimes, all the rest of it, all that money stays here, whether it's in people's pockets because they're not spending, it's not being taxed away from them, and the money being taken, to fund the East, all that money stays here. So we're going to have a booming economy with a massive tax base, where we could pay for everything that we need to do, both out of oil and gas royalties and corporate taxes. Like, we could have a really low corporate tax rate of 10%. Our province would be flooded with corporations wanting to come and locate here, to take advantage of, low taxes, the elimination of all Canadian federal regulation, right? Et cetera, et cetera. I mean, for the life of me, I can't understand anybody that thinks that we're better off if we stay in Canada. And nobody, and to be clear, nobody on that side of the argument, any of your left-wing argument relatives, Danielle Smith, anybody in the NDP, nobody can make an economic case as to why Albertans would be better off economically if they stayed in Canada. Because again, we're going to get one more pipeline. Well, we're going to get more pipelines anyway. Like, one of the main reasons I've been to Washington, D.C., I've met with senior members of the current U.S. administration. The main reason that they support Alberta independence is for the U.S. national security and U.S. energy security, right? So, they want our oil and gas. We could easily have 3 new pipelines through Montana tomorrow if we didn't have the federal government blocking, that from happening. The Canadian federal government, not the U.S. federal government. We're not landlocked, we're policy locked, and the policies that are shutting in our industries come out of Ottawa, not Edmonton or Washington for that matter.
So we'll make sure we'll link the document and everything in the description.
Yeah, please do. Please do. It's on the APP
100%.
website, and all of your viewers should read it. It's amazing, and and it's really a lot of fun because now this document, the Value of Freedom document, is really is being circulated far and wide in all of the C-suites across Alberta, right? And I'm getting texts all the time. Hey, I just gave this buddy with that document of mine to a CEO that runs a major, oil and gas company, or I just gave your document to a, CEO of a major engineering firm. I just gave your document to, the CEO of, XYZ, right? And it's like, and the one comment that we keep getting back from everybody is, well, it's obvious that you guys are sandbagging. You're understating the amount of revenue and the amount of wealth that we're going to have after independence, by a huge factor. And it's like, yeah, we did that intentionally. Like, we want everybody to understand that the numbers in this document are extremely conservative, and that's the reaction we're getting from everybody that understands business and everybody that understands economics and everybody that understands the revenue picture of this province. When they read that document, they're going like, yeah, that's really, really conservative. And why wouldn't we be doing this? And why shouldn't we be doing this?
So just to kind of reiterate, it seems like you're painting like a positive vision for the future. And a lot of that comes down to the kind of financial side of things. But there's also
what else is there?
Well, no, there's the freedom aspect. There's the Constitution. There's the putting limits on the government. There's that side of things as well. And some of these issues will resonate more than others. And some people really value a robust Constitution. Some people see the economic as kind of the primary. So, and I do like how the document outlines the fiscal side of things really well. I was curious on what some of this looks, and one question on kind of with the increased funding for Indigenous services to set up to help reinforce them with what they need to become sovereign entities in Alberta. What does that look like, and what's that relationship within the Crown or the Alberta government at the point. What happens with that, like 4 to 5 billion, if one band is not doing as well as another? Like,
Yeah,
do
but
we
I guess
evaluate
at that
like
point,
what's within?
it's pretty hard to figure out how they wouldn't be doing as well, right? Because the funding would be based on on a per capita basis, right? And the funding model that we're talking about is for all of these funds to go into, in essence, community endowment funds, like an educational endowment fund, an economic endowment fund, economic development endowment fund, a housing, endowment fund, all those types of things where the money just continues to grow and grow and grow and grow, right? We're also talking about respecting, Indigenous sovereignty by letting them take over, like why is it that the province of Alberta needs to license a casino on reserve, right? There's no reason that if a First Nations government, as long as, basic regulations are followed, the casinos aren't engaged in fraud, that people aren't being cheated out of their money, et cetera, et cetera. Why shouldn't First Nations be able to, license and operate casinos, on their own lands without permission of the Alberta government? Why shouldn't they be able to, collect excise tax, on tobacco, or whatever other goods that they want to collect taxes on, on their lands? All of those types of things. They shouldn't need the permission of a government to do those things, right?
So permission's one side of things. Let's say on a reservation, if there was the same kind of corruption that we're seeing with some of the municipalities, of like money is being misallocated or it goes missing.
Yeah,
or
well, but again,
like with the Alberta, like
Sure.
would you step in to apply the same kind of framework or laws that we have to provide?
I think the criminal law is still going to be the criminal law, right? We're going to have one unified criminal code for Alberta, and you're not going to be allowed to to murder somebody with impunity on a First Nations land, as opposed to elsewhere, right? And and again, when I talk about electing, when we're talking about having an elected Senate, based on regions, that would include 2 senators from each treaty area, in the province. And it would include, having First Nations being able to vote for and elect, whoever it is that's going to be, enforcing the law against crooked politicians. And I don't think that, that First Nations politicians should be exempt from prosecution any more than non-First Nations politicians should be exempt from prosecution, right? So we're going to have one unified criminal law that's going to apply equally across the province, be it on reserve or off reserve. And nobody, I think, in their right mind would suggest that anything else would make sense. The problem we have now is that the RCMP and the federal government, are loath to step in and are loath to, enforce the law or investigate cases, allegations of corruption, on reserve. And they certainly should. And I think that's that's an area where, simply the law hasn't been enforced to the degree that it should, and I would hope that would change in an independent Alberta.
So when we were interviewing Bruce about this and we talked about this issue, it was sort of fresh off you guys having your debate on the Sean Newman show, and great episode. I thought you both did excellent, and we liked talking to Bruce, but we wanted to see what. I don't think either of you in that debate really got the chance to flesh out a significant point of contention where you were mentioning to Bruce that it was your contention that his argument was to remove the rights of 300,000 Indigenous Albertans. Bruce was countering, though, was saying, no, he said this on our show anyway, no, it's not so much in the aspect of removing rights of individuals, but rather equalizing rights so that everybody starts on the same playing field in an independent Alberta.
That's just bullshit. I mean, that's pure bullshit, right? He's just trying to dress it up a lot more nicely, and he's trying to get back to the old Reform Party, everybody should be equal thing, right? And I think he got a lot of criticism after that episode because he said a lot of things, frankly, that were really offensive, including, we were going to tear up the treaties into little pieces, we're going to chop the reserves up into little bits. He said a lot of things that were really inflammatory and, for quite frankly, really stupid. And, that he's trying to backpedal from and hide it behind this the semantic game that everybody should be equal. And my point to that is nobody's equal, right? everybody has, different rights and different economic interests across our society. First Nations people's rights, whether people like it or not, find their basis in property law and property rights. Whether people want to acknowledge it or not, their grandparents and great grandparents owned all, as a matter of law, owned all of the land in Alberta, all of it, right? And by treaty and agreement with the Crown, they relinquished their ownership interests in the land subject to, trust agreements that are called treaties, right? So what Bruce is effectively proposing is that, well, white people can have their property rights and white people can pass down, their property from generation to generation. And the Westons and the Bronfmans and the Woodwards and all those people can have their transgenerational trusts, but the First Nations people can't. So, one of the things that I don't know if I said it in that debate or not, but, I noticed that when Bruce talks about how much he hates this idea of, communal ownership of land, he's not picking on the Hutterites. You know what I mean? Like, so, what I, and don't and everybody thinks that Bruce and I don't like one another. I really like him. I think he has a marvelous intellect. He and I have had some wonderful conversations. We agree on probably 90% of things because we're both trained as lawyers. We have a similar background. We have similar education. We're capable of having, as I guess as heated as that episode was on the Sean Newman podcast.
Passionate.
Yeah. I mean, we disagree vehemently on that point. And I think with the greatest respect to Bruce is that he doesn't really understand treaty and Aboriginal rights law, doesn't understand the depth of the history behind it, and why it is in an independent Alberta, we're best to respect those rights on a going forward basis as to trying to reopen them and relitigate them. Like, as an example, most Canadians and most Albertans don't know that the entire mineral title to Northern Alberta was obtained by fraud, right? By the federal government under Treaty Number 8. I have correspondence in my office, and it's archival material, so I don't think you can burn down my office and the documents go away. These aren't secret documents, right? But there was there's an RCMP colonel by the name of Walker who, was trying to prove his worth to the federal government. He wanted to be a treaty commissioner. And the reason was that if you were a treaty commissioner, there was lots of room for crap and corruption and bribes and, and cheating Indian people out of land and telling people that were entitled to land and severalty that they should get Métis scrip, and then they'd cheat people out of their Métis scrip and, all that kind of stuff, right? So there was lots of money to be made if you're a treaty commissioner. So Walker writes this letter to the Minister of the Interior, Clifford Sifton, at the time, and says, "Dear sir, we need to get it, because they had a failed treaty commission to Treaty 8 in 1891. It just didn't come together. And Walker was trying to get this treaty commission back up and running, and he wanted to be the commissioner. So he says, we got to get a deal done with the Indians before they find out the value of their minerals in their territory. Because once they find out the value of the minerals, they're going to want far more for their rights than they do at present, right? Yeah. That's documented, right? Wow. And what most Albertans don't understand, like the Bruce Party, everybody should be equal people, don't understand, don't acknowledge, don't know, is that, the Geologic Survey of Canada was in Alberta, in the 1880s and 1890s, right? So they were, they knew how big the oil and gas resource of Northern Alberta was, even in the 1890s. They're writing letters. Oh my goodness, this is the biggest oil field in North America, if not the world. This will put the oil fields of Pennsylvania to shame. And, if you want to hear something really funny, there's a place called Athabasca Landing, where in the 1880s, prior to Treaty 8, Geologic Survey of Canada went in with an old wooden drill rig. So no blowout preventers, no, you can see where this is going. And they just think it's a good idea to go up in Northern Alberta and start punching holes in the ground that are 1,000 feet or more deep, right? So anyway, they set one of these rigs up on a sandbar in the Athabasca River near a place called Pelican Narrows, and they hit a gas pocket that blew Wildcat out of control for 60 years. And it literally created a microclimate in the middle of the Athabasca River. It's since burned itself out, but ferns were growing, and it was all very Jurassic Park because we had all this heat and CO2 and all these wonderful gases being released that are actually good for plants, right? Being released in the middle of the Athabasca River Valley. Wow. That created a microclimate in that area, right? That's all part of Alberta's history, right? And guys like Bruce are ignorant of that, and they don't understand that we don't want to keep litigating these issues with, Alberta First Nations, because one day, somebody else, a judge could end up saying, well, Mr. Party, you're right. I guess we don't have a treaty anymore. All of that land in Treaty 8 is now unceded Aboriginal title land. And we better get ready to write them a check for $40 trillion for all the natural resources we've taken out of their land under a fraudulent treaty.
Mm.
Right. So, there's a lot of reasons, as to why, First Nations people in this province need to be respected. They need to be treated, equitably and respectfully. And, and then on top of it, what I was telling Bruce was, from a practical perspective, we are not going to win a referendum, where we convince, Albertans that we're responsible enough to, to be independent, while we're going to war with 300,000 Aboriginal people in this province because we refuse to respect their rights. To me, it's just a non-starter. And, it might be, a nice little academic thing for Bruce to do, or it might be a good way for him to get clicks on whatever he's doing, or that, he can get attention by, saying this stuff. But, as I told him on the Sean Newman debate, and as I've told him privately in a very, collegial fashion, it doesn't help. And, if you want to go, insult and annoy Indigenous people, go back to Ontario and do it there, because doing it in Alberta isn't helping us one little bit. And you got to decide what you want to be. Do you want to see a free and independent Alberta, or do you want to continue to nurture your antipathy for Indigenous people having rights that you don't have? So for me, that's the issue, right?
So, Jeff, with your passion and your obvious, respect and care for the Indigenous communities, First Nation groups, I mean, you have it in your plan. Every time you get asked about it, you say very, very similar, very similar intentions. Why do you think then there is such sort of an immediate, visceral kind of negative reaction that we've seen publicized by the Indigenous groups? Like James and I were at the that rally for Alberta independence that was held soon after the last federal election, and there were a number of Indigenous groups there that we were walking around documenting and hearing talking, and they immediately had such a negative reaction to it. Why do you think that is?
Well, unfortunately, I think a lot of them, have been, have been propagandized, right? I mean, look at the, they were told, every one of them was told to get vaccinated. I think the highest vaccine take-up rates in Canada were probably on reserve, right? So, they're constantly being told, that the government is here to help them, and you got to believe the government, and, that, the government is good for you. So, that's something that they, it has to be overcome for sure. But that being said, I mean, my question for every Indigenous person in Alberta and every chief and council, why do you think that, or why is it that you support, $15 billion a year going to Quebec, to the benefit of, the citizens of Quebec, Montreal, Quebec City, et cetera, when a good portion of that money could stay in Alberta and go directly to your communities for the benefit of your communities in an independent Alberta? And I think, the word is getting out. We're slowly making inroads into the broader Indigenous community, and saying, look, don't look at this as a threat. Look at this as an opportunity, right? Because at the end of the day, I mean, the intention of everybody that I'm working with, and even all the rooms that I'm speaking to where there's 800, 1,000 people, when I talk about our plan to triple the spend for Indigenous people in this province, to lift them out of the poverty that the government of Canada has left them in, I get nothing but applause. I mean, sure, there's the odd person that's been listening to Bruce Party and wanders around muttering, well, why shouldn't everybody be equal? We want everybody to be equal, and why are blah, 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 blah. But they're the vast minority in our movement, right? The majority of Albertans respect treaty and Aboriginal rights, think it's a national embarrassment that we still have communities in Alberta that don't have safe and clean drinking water. That where they're, forced to live 3 generations deep in a crappy 1,250 square foot CMHC house that's chock full of black mold and it's falling down around their ears. I mean, I think if the average Albertan, saw the level of poverty that, that Indigenous people in this province have been forced to live in by the government of Canada, they would weep. I mean, I know I have. I mean, I've been door to door in these communities and I've seen the level of poverty in these communities. It's heartbreaking. It really is. And there's no excuse for it.
So you have almost 2 trains of thought, and I hear this, and the counter protesters, they were talking about Canada being a corrupt, genocidal state. And then at the same time, they're waving like a Canadian flag, still
Oh, I
wanting
know.
to stay
Yeah,
in
I mean,
Canada. And like, what is
exactly.
it that
And I
like?
mean,
Wouldn't it be a good opportunity to rethink and or like work with a new government and a new structure that is not corrupt in the same way? Like,
oh, absolutely. I mean, I hope the first president or prime minister of Alberta is an Indigenous person. Certainly we're going to have Indigenous senators. We're going to have, we're going to have, respect for Indigenous rights is going to be baked into a constitution of a free and independent Alberta. I mean, they need to look at this as an opportunity, not as a challenge or not as a threat. And again, having guys like Bruce Party running around saying, we're going to tear up the treaties and chop the reserves up into little bits and making asinine comments like that don't help, because that's not what's going to happen. It'll literally be over my dead body. I didn't wake up one day, and this is actually one of the reasons that I was involved in founding the Alberta Prosperity Project, along with Lawrence Courteray, who's a former vice chief of the Assembly of First Nations. I was really uncomfortable with all of the independence groups in Alberta, and the degree of antipathy a lot of those groups exhibited towards, Indigenous rights, as well as other minority rights. So, we wanted to create an organization where thinking people who are well educated, that were uncomfortable, with less informed opinions on certain issues, we're not going to be holding sway in the context of some sort of political organization, right? So, really, that's to me why I was involved in founding APP. Was I believe that Alberta independence is our only way forward, but I wasn't comfortable with some of the positions that a lot of the independence groups take on certain issues, right?
What do you think right now is the primary impediment to a successful referendum vote?
Danielle Smith.
Okay.
Really? I mean, we'll see. I mean, she still has 3 months left to go in her courtship with Mark Carney. She gave him 6 months. I mean, none of us actually think that there's any hope whatsoever that that Mark Carney is going to give her anything she wants. And then Danielle is going to have a very, very difficult decision to make. And that is, does she go with 70% of the people of her base, which are the people that elected her? Or, is she going to continue to sell us out to the Federalists? Right. And, in my heart of hearts, I think Danielle, will come over to our side at the end of the day when Carney, proves himself to be the liar we all know that he is. Right. There won't be a pipeline deal in 6 months. I mean, so what? She gets these memorandums of understanding with, Doug Ford and, whoever else. Wab Canoe, refused to sign, an MOU. So any hope of a pipeline through Manitoba is toast, right? Doug Ford, I mean, when's Danielle going to wake up to the fact that, of course, Doug Ford wants a new pipeline to Ontario? He wants all the refining jobs in Ontario. So why are we building pipelines instead of building refineries in Alberta? In independent Alberta, we don't even need pipelines. We'll just build more refineries. We'll have so much excess fiscal capacity that we could enter into private-public partnerships and build, massive refineries. And then we'll just ship all of our gas and diesel out by train, and we won't ship crude oil anymore. Or we'll convert our existing crude pipelines into gasoline or diesel pipelines. And instead of that, the end point of those pipelines being a U.S. refinery, it'll just be a distribution hub where all the gas and diesel can be distributed out to the broader U.S. market. We have lots of options, right? In an independent Alberta, once we're free of all this carbon, all this stupid carbon nonsense, right? I mean, hell, the Montney gas field, as an example, has now been estimated at 4 trillion cubic feet of gas, right? We could, we could set up a massive AI data center hub in and around Grand Prairie, right? The cooling costs would be next to nothing for 6 or 7 months of the year.
No kidding.
Right? And then on top of it, you just set up a giant cogeneration plant. We don't even need nuclear power. Like, why is anybody even talking about nuclear power? I'll tell you why, because Brookfield is heavily invested in small modular nuclear reactors, right? So, we can build massive cogen plants in and around Grand Prairie, plug them into the Montney gas field, and we'd have enough gas in that field to power those plants and those AI hubs for 1,000 years. Without having to worry about how we're going to dispose of, leftover nuclear fuel, nuclear waste, or alternative, and alternatively, the corruption inherent of, putting all of these nuclear, modular nuclear plants into the Alberta power grid so that we could all be forced to buy electric cars, so that every time we go to plug in our electric car, the money goes straight to Brookfield, then from Brookfield into Carney's offshore bank account. That's his plan. I mean, that's his so-called energy corridor. His energy corridor is really a money corridor to continue sucking money out of Alberta into the coffers of Brookfield and into all of his offshore bank accounts. Why do we want to stay in a country that does this to us? I mean, I was talking to people at, I think it was, recently at that Calgary Lougheed Courage to Listen event, and I was talking about stakeholder capitalism and, Carney's Bill C5 that's now passed with the unanimous support of the Conservatives, and with Danielle Smith getting out her little cheerleader pom-poms going, yay, Bill C5. And Bill C5, right, really is just, is just stakeholder capitalism on steroids, right? Carney gets to pick who wins and who loses. He gets to pick which companies are exempt from federal law. He gets to pick which companies get sole source federal contracts, et cetera, et cetera. And, what I was saying is that it reminds me of Mussolini's program in the 30s, that they called fascisti, everybody working together. It was just basically stakeholder capitalism. And of course, those people that don't remember what fascisti means, it's fascism, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, why do we want to stay in a fascist country where Mark Carney is our fascist dictator? And I mean that in an economic sense, because fascism was an economic program, right? Yeah. This isn't, you're a fascist and Donald Trump is a fascist. No, the real fascist is Mark Carney, because he's enacted a fascist piece of legislation that completely follows what Mussolini did in Italy. So it's classical fascism, but nobody wants to wake up or pay attention to that. And for all of your left-leaning, cousins and friends that are so concerned about, Canada's such a great place, go pick up a history book. Look at what Mussolini's form of fascism was, and then tell us, how that differs from what Mark Carney is doing. And everybody forgets that the Z part in Nazi comes from socialism, is national socialism, right? Which is effectively, without the concentration camps. Well, I guess yet, because I mean, Chivot hasn't started locking us all up for internet crime yet, but
don't I'm speak sure too soon. Come.
But yeah, don't speak too soon. But I mean, basically, Carney is enacting, the same program that, that Hitler and Mussolini had in place, where the great leader, the Führer, got to pick who got what government contracts, what laws, what federal laws they're going to be exempt from, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's like everything old is new again. And it's called Bill C5. The Canadian, Mark Carney is the boss of all of this act, right? It's just ludicrous.
Yeah, so we're seeing this, I guess, if you wanted to label it, it would be technocratic, oligarchical collectivism. And it's a new flavor. Like, it's, as things evolve, like
meet the new boss,
same as
the old boss.
Yeah.
Is that an actual thing? Is that what they call it? Is that what somebody calls it?
I think, I can't remember who was coining that, but they're trying to define what this new flavor of...
My actual words for what's going on in Canada right now is we've become an oligarchic kleptocracy.
Mm.
Basically we have Carney and all of his buddies that define themselves as the stakeholders in stakeholder capitalism. Because just know that you and I are not the stakeholders.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Stakeholder capitalism. The stakeholders are the boards of directors and the people that have the offshore bank accounts. Those are the stakeholders, right?
Yeah.
So,
I think it was pointing to more the like WF and that side of things was their goals. They're pushing it towards the technocratic piece is a very important.
Yeah, but again, exactly, right? So it's, the fifth industrial revolution, it's really the Fourth Reich. When it comes right down to it. I mean, we're the useless eaters, we're the ordinary people, as Mark Carney would call us, that are going to experience pain and suffering and, frozen assets and stranded assets and, all the rest of it, because they get to define on an ongoing basis which assets get stranded and which assets do not get stranded.
Which RBC accounts to close.
Yeah, which RBC, which bank accounts to freeze and which ones not to freeze, and who's allowed to have, who has enough social credit score to continue to be allowed to have a bank account, all of those things. We're watching it play out in real time, before our eyes.
Unfortunately, Mike and I are hiding dangerous memes under the floorboards right now. So,
oh, good for you, yeah.
Jeff. This has been awesome. I don't know. I think we could probably carry this on for another 2 hours, but just to respect your time, is there anything that we didn't touch on so far that you think that we should? Anything that actually, there was one point that we talked about before we hit record that you wanted to touch on about a regulation that was proposed.
Oh no! Well, a regulation, or are we talking about that
trying to strike
that
down
that silly application to the court brought by the
That's what I
electoral
mean.
Constitutionality of the
Yeah.
So just I'll give everybody the quick answer on that. So proving the fact that he's completely biased, Gordon McClure, the chief electoral officer of Alberta, referred Mitch Sylvester's question, specifically, do you agree that Alberta should become a sovereign country and cease to be a province of Canada, to the court to determine whether that question is unconstitutional and whether it offends various provisions of the Charter and Section 35(1) of the Constitution Act, right? It's a pretty silly application. Interestingly, the lawyer that forwarded it is a lawyer by the name of Joseph Redmond, at the Shores Jardine firm in Edmonton, which, as I understand, is a pretty left-wing labor law firm in Edmonton. So you see who's getting paid here, right? They put forward this argument without actually saying how, gathering signatures on a petition could in any way threaten anyone's democratic rights, their mobility rights. We're talking about getting signatures on a petition. How does that threaten anybody's rights? How does that offend the treaty right? Getting signatures on a petition, because that's all we're talking about doing, right? So the whole application is silly, but, obviously they're trying to delay. They put forward to the court that, oh my goodness, we are, the electoral officer takes no position with regard to this application because he's objective and unbiased. We think there should be 2 amicus curiae appointed. We've selected a lawyer from the Reynolds Murph firm and a university professor from the University of Alberta. And we should have a 2-week period of advertising so that we can have interveners from all over the province join into this dogfight over nothing, right? So that's what they're trying to do, is they're just basically trying to tie us up in red tape and, and prevent us from moving forward. I was actually pleased to see that Premier Smith and Mickey Amory came out today and announced that they think that the electoral officer should withdraw his question to the court because it's anti-democratic and flies in the face of the intention of the legislature to allow Albertans to have a say on issues like this. But again, from us, I liked it. I'm a litigator, so it's like, oh, don't throw me in that briar patch. Oh, I hate being in a courtroom. Don't make me argue constitutional law. I'm really no good at it after 35 years and winning cases all the way to the Supreme Court and back. Don't send me to a courtroom, right? So we find that aspect of it kind of amusing, but but for us, it just demonstrates how biased the electoral officer is. Because why didn't he send little Tommy Lukasik's question to the court to determine whether or not it was constitutional? I mean, Tommy Lukasik wants to effectively enjoin his fellow Albertans from leaving Canada. So Tommy Lukasik, wants to impact the democratic rights of his fellow citizens. He wants to impact, our freedom of association, our freedom of expression, all of those types of things. Why wasn't his question referred to the court? And I'll tell you why. It's because, he's supported by the NDP, and Gordon McClure, obviously prefers, left-wing positions and left-wing lawyers over positions that are being put forward by people that are serious about independence, right? So that's what we're dealing with. And I mean, obviously, we have, 100 good arguments as to why this is all really, really silly. We're in the process of writing a legal brief that will be filing with the court either late this week or early next week, that'll address, all of these issues. And when we do that, you guys can either have us back on or reach out to me, and I'll give you a link to it or send you a copy of it so that your viewers can understand, how silly this entire process, is that the electoral officer is trying to turn this into, right? Because I mean, think about how dumb that is, right? Like, oh, well, does asking a question or asking your fellow citizens to sign a petition to have a question on a referendum ballot offend the constitutionally protected rights of another citizen? How the hell could that offend anybody else's constitutionally protected rights? How does that offend a treaty right? Right?
It sounds like something a leftist would say, like Lukaszuk.
Yeah, I mean, it has nothing to do with treaty rights. I mean, treaty rights aren't even engaged until, we actually get all of the signatures that we need. We have a referendum and the majority of citizens vote yes. And the government of Alberta decides to do something about it. Because after the equalization referendum, we saw how good the government of Alberta is at ignoring the clear wishes of the majority of its citizens in and around, a matter like equalization. They've done nothing about it. So, it wouldn't be until the government of Alberta decided to start negotiating with Canada over independence, and then in the context of that, decided to ignore Aboriginal people and say, screw you, we don't need to consult with you, we don't need to talk to you, we're going to treat you like it, we're going to treat you like it's 1990 all over again and not talk to you anymore, just like we did before Jeff Rath started beating us up and winning all those cases against us in court. We'll just roll the clock back 50 years and that's what we're going to do. I mean, at that point, people could say, yeah, that's unconstitutional and there should be a remedy. But to tell people that simply, wanting to get signatures on a petition to ask a question offends the Constitution. I mean, the very fact that they're doing this offends our constitutional rights to freedom of expression, democratic rights, freedom of assembly, and so on. Right? It's pretty offensive. And I think Danielle Smith, and I credit to her and credit to Mickey Amory for calling out Gordon McClure on that. And I'm going to call, and I would also mention the lawyer Joseph Redmond, who's involved in this. They really need to, they really need to come out and explain why what they're doing, isn't just frivolous and vexatious, because really that's what it seems to be to me.
So our democratic right to have a citizen-led petition just happens to be on a question that may interact with the Constitution once it's fully fleshed out. But
and what's so stupid? If you look at the act and if you look at the form, right, that you fill out, is this a constitutional question or a non-constitutional question, right? Clearly this is a constitutional question, right?
Yeah.
And, and we're moving forward accordingly. But how can asking a constitutional question be unconstitutional? I'm still trying to get my head around it. I mean, Eva Chipiuk and I have been working on it all afternoon. And we've actually, to be quite honest, we've been having a lot of fun with it because we actually think that it's a pretty silly position for them to put forward. And I really appreciate actually the opportunity that they've now given us to be able to talk about this for the next month, as to why it is that we need to be independent so that we can have a constitution that will prevent left-wing bureaucrats like Gordon McClure, playing these silly games, in a manner that completely disrespects the democratic rights of citizens of Alberta.
So yeah, that sounds just like, maybe they had an idea in the back of their head, like, hey, let's tie Rath up in court with this bullshit for a little while so he's not out on the road talking about Alberta independence.
I don't even know what they were thinking. I mean, I don't think they were thinking very much. They made themselves look really bad, right? I mean, I don't know where the government continues to find people that are this competent, to work for them. I mean, it's like, it was like Danielle Smith appointing Mark Joffe to be the chief medical officer of Alberta. I mean, Joffe's big claim to fame during the pandemic was he wrote a letter to one of my clients, Eric Payne, and told Eric that if he didn't want to get the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine, he should go out and get either the Johnson & Johnson or AstraZeneca vaccine, both of which then were pulled from the market as being unsafe for human consumption, right?
Aged like milk,
Oh, yeah. So, it's shocking the degree to which the government has the capacity to hire people that are completely incompetent. I mean, Dina Hinshaw, there's another one, right? She's telling people to mix and match the vaccines. Every single vaccine manufacturer had right in their monograph that we do not recommend that you mix our vaccine product with anybody else's because it's not been tested. It's not safe. And there's Danielle telling everybody to mix and match the vaccines. Or not Danielle, I'm sorry. Dina Hinshaw telling everybody to mix and match the vaccines. And then Danielle has Gary Davidson and a whole team of doctors put together a massive report. And this report identified a study out of the Nordic countries that showed that if you mixed and matched the vaccines, you're at 3,600% more risk of contracting myocarditis.
Wow.
Right. So, I mean, the one thing you can say about government is they sure have a knack for hiring the most incompetent people that they can find.
So
And I guess, I mean, going back to it, I mean, Dina Hinshaw now has the distinction of having been fired twice in a 12-month period by the Alberta government. Right. So, I mean, at least they did something right. But, there's a lot more people buried in that bureaucracy that need to be hauled up from underneath their desks and fired. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah. So it seems like we're gonna see some increased pushback, and each is an opportunity to show the corruption in real time by throwing up a mirror and highlighting it. So
we feel about it, and and quite frankly, as far as we're concerned, we're happy about this. I mean, I was talking to Mitch Sylvester about it this afternoon. Once he finally stopped bragging about all the massive salmon that he was catching and sending me pictures of the 38-pound salmon his daughter caught. It was amazing. But anyway, once we got through all of that, Mitch and I were talking about how happy we are that they're pulling all of this, all of this nonsense, because it just demonstrates the fact that they're getting desperate. I mean, think about where we started, right? Jason Kenney, Jeff Rath is there's a traitorous kook, and this is the tail wagging the dog, and we don't have to pay attention to these people because it's just a few loudmouth malcontents, right? Now it's like, okay, well, a few loudmouth malcontents has now turned into about 39 or 40, between 39 and 40, 39 and 49% of the province, right? I've seen some polling that indicates we're now over 50%.
Wow.
Right. So we're obviously making massive progress. More and more Albertans are focusing on the benefits of independence. And, and I keep telling everybody, hey, this is it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. And, we have 12 months to convince our fellow Albertans that this is the best thing for everybody. If you care about your kids, if you care about, your own prosperity, if you care about freedom, if you care about your grandchildren having a future, vote yes, to Alberta becoming an independent country. I mean, it's that simple.
I think that's a perfect place to end it. Awesome. Jeff, hey, thank you so much. We've interviewed, we've talked a lot about on this show, and we've interviewed a few people, and I gotta say, man, like it feels so cool to have somebody so passionate, somebody so knowledgeable, somebody with such passion behind them that this movement really needs. And I think honestly, you're just the guy for it. So the miles you're putting on the road, the town halls you're doing, all the speaking engagement, all the podcasts, all the interviews, super appreciated, man. We're behind you, and we think that you're gonna lead this movement to success. So thanks for everything you're doing.
Thank you both very much for having me on. It was really an honor and a pleasure to be here. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Cheers.